The next session is called Understanding, which is struck through predicting media, and a sort of very brief anecdote as a means of introduction. Last year I was a guest on the New Models podcast, and that baby clearly wasn't. No need to be mean about it. And I was on the New Models podcast. It was midnight because it's still Ramadan, so the New Models team very kindly accommodated my nocturnal schedule, and I was on there with the art writer and living meme Dean Kissick, and I blurted out the phrase "the end of history," and one of the co-hosts, Little Internet, replied, quote, "like history too?" ? Umpteen DMs later, we collectively decided that the way to spell this neologism is HSTRY2, all in capitals, adopting that recent branding vogue of eliminating vowels. So history 2 is history sequel, or prequel, or reboot. No one is entirely sure, but we do know that it's a revenge of history 2 on history with a capital H, set to an erratic, broken laugh track. History 2 trolls us. History 2 is the illusion of the new world about to happen at the dawn of Endcore. New Models are a legend in their own lifetime: podcast, media experiment, community, and also hosts to an incredible Discord that produces some of the best memes that I certainly know of. New Models have significantly contributed to the discourses many of us care about in the last decade. Along with Dan Keller, who is not here, Dan lives in America, Carly, Busta, and Little Internet take unserious things seriously with wit and wonder, which is why I have the pleasure of inviting them here today. And in a sense, this is part of an ongoing conversation that we've been having for a number of months, which really started very informally over dinner, and seems to now have taken a certain sort of momentum more formally at a number of talks that they've been giving. And the question is really very, very simple. The question is, what could possibly come after social media? Recommendation media, ? Community as media, ? Web3 decentralized anti-social media, ? So New Models, I asked them to chart the contours of the media maximalist 2010s, something that they're extremely familiar and eloquent about, a decade of endless podcasts, streams, and sensational takes, in order to point us to where the rest of this decade could venture next. So how it's going to work is Carly and Little Internet are going to give us a lecture for about 20-25 minutes. Then they're going to park themselves down on these fantastically comfortable white leather couches that we seem to have imported from a really bad nightclub in Beirut. And then for the next 20-25 minutes, we'll be delving deeper into the things that they've been showing us, and obviously open up to you guys. So if you have a question, please do intervene. But for now, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Carly and Julian from New Models. Thank you.
All right. Well, Shuman, thank you. I think that's like the first half of our talk right there. You said it more eloquently than we could, certainly. Thank you to Art Dubai for bringing us here from Berlin. It's our first time, and it's pretty much blowing our minds. So it's really great to be here. Thank you to Fatima and Leo for all the arrangements, and Shuman for planting the seed for this entire talk.
Sorry I missed the after party last night. I heard it was amazing, but there was a triumvirate of back to back to back that I probably shouldn't have broken. It was exactly. A magic moment, but sorry I missed everyone who was there.
Okay, good. So as Shuman said, the seed for this talk, it took shape this summer. We were having this conversation about the post-COVID media economy, and Shuman just raised this very simple question: what will the next era of media be? At the time, there was this new confusion of post-lockdown media, but there's also a freedom in the way people were communicating both on and offline. At the time, vibe shift was trending. Russia's war in Ukraine had recently escalated, crypto was crashing, and it seemed, as Schuman indicated, Fukuyama's end of history declaration was once again up for debate. As a prompt, Schuman ran through the media eras. Mainstream, indie, social, recommendation media, and then turned to us, and this is again around like midnight or something. So what's next? As though we'd have an immediate answer. In fact, it was a subject we had been thinking about intensely. How does a shift in the dominant media apparatus alter the kinds of content we make, alter the way that content is able to circulate, and the types of responses to it? And what media apparatus was now emergent? This is, of course, classic media theory a la Marshall McLuhan. The medium is the message or massage. But every so often, navigation tools need to be recalibrated to the new conditions. And so this is what we'd like to do here and share with you all. The answer to Schuman's question will be the focus of this talk and will lead into a speed round of speculation by Little Internet of its effects. But first, we want to take a second and set up some common coordinates, some working models for how media functioned previously and currently functions now. And for the first part of this talk, I'll be giving the boring history stuff, and then we'll hand it over to Little Internet Julian, who will then take us through the second half. Okay. To borrow an analogy from yesterday's talk, let's carry forward this idea of hardware and software. And to this, let's add an intermediary layer, protocol. An era's dominant media is dependent on the hardware, of course. Radio, television, home computers, mobile smart devices, etc. Then there's the element of protocol, the way that hardware can be programmed, how information within that piece of hardware or across various devices, groupings of devices, can be composed. The audience, now probably better described as users, interact with devices to access software that has been determined by a combo of hardware and the protocol that hardware allows. And this combo, hardware, protocol, software, produces a particular kind of public. This is a slide from a different talk, but I inserted it here. On the left, it's a Hogarth etching from 1755 depicting a hotly contested and populism-ridden election. This is also around the time when we start to see mass media first emerge, right, with industrialized printing. Mass media is a technology for producing a public. And I love this idea. Editors don't make magazines, they create audiences, right? Because we know that the job of the editor, whether it's Anna Wintour or her staff, it's always creating a public or creating an audience, which can then be sold as the publication's primary product to advertisers or presented to sponsors for funding. And this isn't a negative thing. This is just the economics of how the media works. But it's important to keep in mind. Technology creates publics, creates particular kinds of audiences. But to get back to Schuman's question regarding media eras, it's worth thinking about each area of media, both in terms of its technology and the nature of its public. I think we can get to the next slide. I think when we speak about generations, more than anything, what we're really speaking about are age cohorts whose reality have been shaped by a specific media era, right? This is a gross generalization, as of course mainstream media has its roots in industrialized print and of course radio. But to sketch out the point, TV furthered the stronghold of mass media, a kind of protocol that brought together image and sound, creating a dynamic mainstream signal. The rise of desktop publishing in the 80s and 90s and home video recorders provided the hardware for decentralized media protocol. Like before the internet, Purple, ID, The Face, etc. This is like a decentralized form of media, right? And this is happening just with print, not with, desktop computers that are producing print, right? And so we have decentralization and democratization during this era. The innovation of internet connected through IRL friends, therefore allows the possibility of a media network distributed via your friend channels. So you're not just getting on AOL, you're actually sharing information directly with your friends. Your friends are starting to become a kind of media. And this, of course, was disrupted by a protocol that, based on your organic activity, would optimize the flow of information for you, algorithmic media. And this is, sort of correlated to Gen Z. I mean, this is a really gross grouping, but I think we can think about generations through media in a productive way. Importantly, each era of technology has a unique physics. It impacts the kinds of content we make, alters the way that content is able to circulate, and the types of responses to it.
We like to use the term platform physics to describe the hard-coded mechanics and incentives of the platforms, whether digital or analog, that we use every day. Physics because we are just as bound by them as we are by gravity in the real world. A working definition, platform physics are the ways in which a medium's design or user interface determines a piece of content's nature, its natural motion through a network, its recipient's response, as well as various nth-order effects. The physics of the monthly art magazine were compatible with the typical monthly rhythm of gallery shows, allowing time for consensus around an artist's new work to percolate through a scene before the critic's word influenced the art's reception. More recently, features such as the retweet allowed for rapid virality, creating a power law for content where a small subset attracts outsized attention. The differing physics of these two protocols produce two different kinds of criticism, and in turn, two different kinds of audiences. One of the most important and useful visual analogies I've ever encountered is Conway's Game of Life, a cellular automata game in which a set of starting points are plotted on a grid and then 4 very simple rules are applied to them. Depending on the initial arrangement of the points, very different phenomena can emerge, sometimes simple ones and sometimes ones that are extremely complex, to the point of resembling machines or even life as you see here. We can liken the basic rules of Conway's Game of Life to the rules governing a protocol's physics. Likes, retweets, follows, the tuning of the recommendation algorithm. And this, in turn, gives rise to the unique kinds of context, content, engagement, and therefore arrangements of the social sphere, which and nth-order effects that can become unimaginably and unanticipatedly complex.
And sometimes toxic, or
yes,
as we've seen in the past few years. For our part, a major shift in media protocol, and therefore its physics, during the 2010s compelled us to leave our relatively established positions in publishing and music. Unlike the emergence of small magazines and even early Web 2 social media, the rise of algorithmically driven digital channels completely destabilized the economic system of top-down publishing and broadcasting, this long-standing model. What we call linear media. Around 2015 or 16, our experience of the culture sector felt something like this, with massive chunks calving from the legacy media apparatus. Music labels went broke when streaming overtook record sales. Long-standing print publications were forced to go digital first, often making their content free. In turn, ever fewer writers could afford to take on editorial gigs, as payment was often offered in the form of exposure or list spots or merch. And with this rapid melting event, the culture sector's critical terrain turned into a bog, a swampy mess of signs and information. In earlier eras, you might ask a critic or an artist, where do you stand? As in this famous Jörg Immendorf painting from 1973, Wo stehst du mit deiner Kunstkollege? Where do you stand with your art colleague? Where the man at the door, presumably Immendorf himself, calls on a fellow artist to join him in revolution. But today, one would first need to establish what ground was even underfoot before making any claims regarding political or aesthetic alignment. As Sissel, Tolas, and Refik Anadol yesterday noted, glacial ice is constantly changing and moving, and it's often difficult to ascertain what is stable and what is about to give way. For an artist or critic working today, one must first understand the protocol, the physics, of how an artwork or a piece of criticism circulates before formatting one's ideas for distribution. So you can have an amazing painting, but if you don't know how that painting is going to circulate through your network, then that painting isn't going to be valuable maybe in the way you intend it to be. Always fine as a personal form of expression, but you have to understand the media environment before you commit to sending something out there and assuming it's going to be effective. Part of the challenge of that is it's very difficult to get a good God's eye view of what today's media apparatus looks like. For about 300 years, even as media technology changed, the general structure of how information flowed remained the same. And that's, the 1780-something Paris Salon, right? Basically, a journalist would pick up a story, work with the publisher to craft a piece of content, and that content was then distributed to an audience who received it, maybe discussed it with their friends, and if particularly moved, would write back to the editor with their thoughts, who would then decide whether the response was worthy of publication. In this configuration, the point of distribution is the power point, the point of attention and authority and value. I think you can go to the next. The place where information and advertising sit side by side. It's very easy to understand, right? There's like a gate, we talk about gatekeeping. That's what's being gatekept, right? There's a PowerPoint that's being gatekept, literally produces power. But as algorithmic media starts to overtake early Web 2 media, as attention is fractured, so too is the power distributed and the narrative decentralized. The professional critic is now competing with citizen journalists who are building personas through social media, which, due to its physics, is a more seductive, rapid reward zone for information. In some ways, this is great. I mean, like, there's a lot of, the democratization can also be a positive thing. But in this configuration, the legacy media dam is no longer capable of generating the power it once could. Of course, as the 2010s wore on, this trend proliferated, and so too did media protocol. Everything with a digital presence, from ride-sharing apps to retail sites, could also be media, right? And during the lockdown period, we saw an explosion of different models emerge. I don't expect you to really make sense of this graph. It's harder to show the confusion. It's around this time, maybe slightly before, the pathways able, As obviously, that's a really bad diagram, but it proves the point that the shift from linear to non-linear media has, one, led to a lot of confusion, and two, requires an entirely different way of thinking. This is from the Joshua Citarella Discord, this emote, giving credit where it's due. It's around this time, maybe slightly before, that pathways able to bypass algorithmic social media became increasingly attractive. As legacy publications tried to stay afloat by engaging with debates that have viral potential, clickbait, the entire Web 2 space starts to feel unbearably noisy and generally very unchic, right? So this is true both for creators, artists, journalists, freelancers who are out of a job or whatnot, who realize they can build their own network outside of legacy channels. It's also true, since we're at Art Dubai, we should make this analogy, of the dealer-collector networks. They don't really want their stuff on Instagram. No one really wants to receive like a PDF of an exhibition. They realize that there's great value and privilege with direct personal communication. So they also start bypassing this entire apparatus. As Web 2 platforms have become less personal and more chaotic, we might liken them to interstate roadways or feed highways with billions of possible exits. We still check them daily, transiting across them for better or worse, but they are decreasingly our primary site of peer-to-peer communication. And nor are they really the vital sites of identity formation that they once were. In this scope, posts that appear on Web 2 media are something like billboards, fleeting pieces of information that momentarily make us laugh or make us annoyed and then occasionally compel us to exit. A successful drive down the feed is one that rapidly delivers you to an exit in a separate information zone or dark forest enclave where deeper exchanges can transpire. This is not to say that the mega roads aren't useful. It's just that their physics are inhospitable to the needs of a more full spectrum communication system. So, working towards an answer to what form of media comes next, we wanted to offer this alternate way of thinking about the media flows now, which is to say, according to how well it is able to compose its own media system, how nimble it is working across various protocols. In order to do this, we need to be aware of the economic model for each form of media and how then it uses Web 2 media to achieve its financial aims. This is very broadly generalized. As we just heard, Vogue Japan is already thinking in different ways. My guess is that a lot of legacy media corporations are thinking in alternate ways. The public has just yet to see what they're going to materialize. And of course, Brian and Maria Paula with Outland and JPEG.space, I put you in this section because you seem very nimble and able to use a constellation of media, but your economic model may not exactly just be commercial gigs and subscriptions, but just to get the general point across. New Models recently interviewed this American sociologist, Kevin Munger, who you're going to know like Willem Flusser in a few years. I swear, he's just genius. And there's something he said that I can't get out of my head. If you and your community do not have a concrete set of norms, practices, and institutions designed to allow you to use the internet without the internet using you, you are destined to lose. In fact, you're not even trying to win. And it's true. I mean, like, maybe you should, if you're taking the interstate, maybe pack a snack and don't just rely on, like, I mean, if you know the American roadway system, internet travel plazas are terrible places. You want to have a better plan in mind. In any case, so with this in mind, we want to propose to Schumann and to all of you that the next era of media is tied to composability. Now, this idea is already quite popular in blockchain communities, but we think the concept extends well beyond Web3 systems, as composable media leads to an area of community as media. Because in this constellation, it is communities interacting with these various composable assemblages of media platforms that make information transfer coherent. Composable assemblages of platforms turn your community into a holographic layer with individuals who have strong connections across multiple communities into literal interfaces, right? They're literal interfaces for information. If we, the next slide, does it work?
I think
yeah, I did. I didn't. Oh, no, we don't have to. Okay. Well, if we go back to this slide, we can see that the vibes category of media is essentially headless. We call it this headless category. There are nodes with more resonance, but the communication is not exactly top down. Like, yes, we have a podcast with new models, but our community is continuously feeding us with ideas. We're like organizing them a bit, but there are so many brilliant minds in our Discord that make that arrangement possible. I'm sure it's similar with JPEG.space. I'm sure it's similar with Outland, where yes, there are people who are organizing it, but it's not exactly an Anna Wintour at the top saying, this is the shade of green that's in or something. It's like more complex than that. But now I hand it to you to take over from here. Do you want me to do your slides?
Sure. Okay. So this is a sort of summary diagram of the core social organizations of online platforms. In the early days of the internet, you had the forum here on the left, a tightly knit groups of discussion and shared interests, communication going back and forth between members. With the scale and physics of Web 2, you see on the right, Web 2 social media, however, power laws take hold and you end up with a skewed structure where virality means that most communication ends up being one way. The most popular accounts down, broadcasting out to their thousands, if not millions of followers. The next structure synthesizes both, the one in the middle, where tightly knit communities interact with each other, but also broadcast out into virality-based Web 2 social media to share their thoughts and attract new members. This, of course, is largely related to the rise of Discord as the primary space of social communication for many. Now, though, we'll get into some speculation, some whys and what's next, particularly for the young and online. So, back a bit. So first of all, AI, not a big deal. It will change probably nothing at all. Just kidding, but I want to start with something else. The bell curve meme. This one is about crypto trading, and for anyone who has ever lost part of their life to it, you know it's true. The low IQ guy on the left buys a dog coin because people like dogs. The guy in the middle tries to research his trades as if assessing a company's quarterly report, analyzing the fundamentarinos, so to speak. And the high IQ guy on the right knows that the crypto market is irrational based on crowds of manic traders and sheer virality. Of course, we know the edges win. In Schumann Basar, Douglas Copeland, and Hans Ulrich Obrist's book, The Extreme Self, they spoke of one of the terms included is the 100ocracy, the fact that online scale is king, and so the middle, the average, the mode is also king. The problem, however, is that this doesn't only apply to entertainment products and narrative production, it applies to exploits and scams. This is why a Windows computer or an Android phone is far more likely to get a virus. They have the most users, and so there are more chances for an exploit to succeed. I anticipate a sort of voiding of the mid on social media as cybercrime explodes and AI-enabled bots emulate and multiply the already dominant average. Younger generations are already suffering from mid-exhaustion, as endless culture warring and didactic grandstanding has made using your voice on social media seem extremely cringe to many young people. But if you think spam and scams are already bad, just wait. The first AI to achieve sentience could be a Twitter men's rights activist who earns a fortune emulating the voices of high net worth individuals to remotely empty their bank accounts. So how to avoid the mid-void? We're seeing with younger people online a sort of return to illegibility, poetics, speaking more in diagrams and images and metaphors and collages and neologisms that AI and the mid do not yet understand. Also, bringing back the sacredness of true names. When something's true name is known, say by taking a distributed cultural phenomenon and naming it Dubai Art Fair Core in a think piece, it can be exploited for attention in other economies. Suddenly, with a true name, that phenomenon is search engine optimized, indexable, consumable by the mid. The idea of true names also applies to the deep paranoia and hatred of doxing one finds in much of the pseudonymous edges of the internet. Nothing could be worse than revealing an anon's true name. Around this void of the mid, dark forests will expand. In the digital and in the real, we need to plant more trees. Everyone will belong to one or more of these dark forests, and they will need to defend their communities and culture from spammers and scammers and from the homogenizing mid. Speaking of scammers, I believe there's a scam-related paradigm shift for those growing up in the 21st century. The dot-com bubble of the late 90s happened because of this now classic scam where the valuation of internet companies is ridiculously high because theoretically the total addressable market is every single person who can access the internet. Of course, that bubble popped, but it's a great scam. We love it. We still do it today. In the early aughts, there was the Iraq War, in which scammer George W. Bush gaslit the world into believing the Iraqis did 9/11. In 2008, the financial crisis, huge scam, did not end well. The crypto bubble. Crypto is a scam and everyone knows it's a scam. Okay, blockchain, it's not a scam, but the scam potential was just too big to not scam. And so there was this massive scam party, like hundreds of thousands of people actively scamming until FTX collapsed and now hopefully the scamming is over. Every ad on American TV now is for pharmaceuticals and sports betting. We all know our phone apps are engineered to be as addictive as possible, taking up as much time and money as they can. Young people are immersed in an addiction economy, full stop, and it's one big scam and they know it. Scam realism is the paradigm of the now, because scamming is the water in which we all swim. Only us 20th century dinosaurs try to still not admit it. Mainstream media and the Twitter punditocracy, they're scammers too in the scam realists framework. So many people using language in slippery ways with sleight of hand semantics, hubristic generalizations, scope derangement, to quote Lauren Boyle of Dis, culture wars that seem to instrumentalize the plight of marginalized minorities as plot points in a massive multiplayer online rhetorical battle royal game. So where do we find truth and where do we find trust? There's so much noise, and why would anyone trust the narratives of the government, corporation, or mainstream media? The COVID era didn't help. Believe science, the Twitter scolds yelled, forgetting that in 1998, leading peer-reviewed medical journal The Lancet published the vaccine autism study that kicked off today's anti-vaxxer movement. After defending the study for over a decade and vilifying the journalists who questioned its veracity, The Lancet finally retracted the study and admitted all along it was a scam. Inversely, the lab leak theory of the COVID outbreak was a conspiracy theory until it wasn't. Paranoid conspiracy isn't my thing. I'm triple vaxxed, and I even still wear a mask on a plane. But I'm not alone in feeling infantilized, gaslit, and confused by the communications of the amorphous behemoths of power over the last few years. For a young person, this experience will shape their relationship to mainstream media for the rest of their lives. Overwhelmed by the sheer volume of conflicting information, hot takes, scold core, and professional managerial class didactic think pieces, people increasingly trust only those they are connected to, whether personally or parasocially. And this is why individuals, podcasters, Substack writers, streamers, and their communities will continue to take the role of trusted sense makers ahead of traditional institutions. Corporations and governments will need to cultivate relationships with these individual sense makers, at least the ones that aren't scammers. And so the 21st century natives think meta. They think how our tech overlords think. That's how big tech scammed everyone, after all, by thinking not on the level of products or services, but realizing if they go meta, they can build an infrastructure through which they can tax every single exchange. The realm of social media discourse and mainstream media is bent, warped, twisted by the physics of its software. So thinking meta, the 21st century native aims to build new protocols, structures that will allow truth and trust to emerge. Whether through blockchain, new nested internets, or a meta-assemblage of various apps, the future of media will come from these experiments on the level of protocol. And through these new protocols, new complexity will emerge through new relationships. World building together, true names can be kept secret, protected from the homogenizing force of the mid, allowing for a return of complexity, uncertainty, deep wisdom, and magic. It even makes a pretty good bell curve. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was so good that I kept telling our timekeeper Smoothie to not keep time. And it's the first time I've done that, this Global Art Forum. So, no, not at all. No, not at all. You could have kept going. I kind of want more. But thank you so much. You really brought it, as they say. I guess just to sort of go back to the very beginning, I suppose, where my question to you came from was not only in this macro sense of, Web 1, Web 2, Web 3, Media 1, Media 2, Media 3, but I suppose at an even more granular level, sort of feeling and also experiencing something, a certain set of phenomena over the last couple of years, and I think particularly, obviously also exacerbated by the pandemic, by being forced to mostly live in what I call the 2.5 dimension, was, seeing the sort of next sort of paradigm era, perhaps, of media coming in. The way in which TikTok seemed to arrive as a not only as a Chinese psyop, but more practically and maybe technologically as an insistence on moving image or video content, right, as opposed to still images. And so we saw Instagram, which is, obviously part of the Meta family and famous for, in a way, never really innovating internally, either buying other kind of platforms or simply stealing the ideas, and then amplifying them because they have such a bigger kind of reach. But there was this sense, there are other timelines, aren't there? In Twitter, the movement from the chronological feed to the non-chronological feed, and then the shift, I think, from the still image to the video image to Reels, obviously Reels being Instagram's attempt at TikTok. And then we've seen, things like Be Real, Mastodon as some sort of desperation escape hatch, from the Elon Twitter era. And so things are clearly up in the air again. And of course, I didn't mention recommendation media, but obviously recommendation media seems to me to be part of that lineage of moving from a chronological feed, for example, to a non-chronological feed, which allows the platform to insert whatever it wants to insert, And I think it was MP yesterday who, railed against the complete uselessness of of Twitter, or the way in which Twitter seems to be going. And I'm sure there are many, many people that sort of agree with that. No, that's kind of, and now we're at this point of kind of having to turn to subscription fees, no, to ostensibly give you the blue check of credibility and authenticity, but ultimately it's just a subscription charge for the first time. So just to, I guess, put a little bit of background in there, I was thinking about something, just to go back to, you know, I think one of your phrases that you're very associated with is this idea of platform physics. And I've been, you know, as you were talking, I mean, maybe I misheard, maybe I didn't, but, you know, two phrases came to mind, which is that, you know, everything is media. And we've also got used to this idea, and I think companies and corporations particularly have been haunted by this phrase that everything is content. Is there a difference between the two now, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, these terms are slippery, right? And there's also this advantage of like misusing terms in order to like develop a new relationship to them, which adds more confusion, right? I mean, we interviewed a younger writer in her mid-20s last week, Olivia Kahn-Sperling. She wrote a great piece of fanfic about Kylie Jenner and Lil Peep, highly recommend it. And we were interested by how she just thought of the entire media landscape as like, she sort of like shifted everything one level up. Like content was no longer like, I'm trying to think of a way to say this simply. Like Twitter produces a kind of content that is almost empty because it's all a surface effect of the protocol of Twitter, right? And of course, if you're affiliated with a group of community like QAnon or something, or just, you know, JPEG.space on the other end of the spectrum, your community is going to, no relation. Your community is going to use Twitter in a certain way. And sort of like that Kevin Munger quote, you sort of have control over how you're using Twitter. You're looking at it in a directed way. But like content itself, content without community, is just a surface effect. Like it's like listening to music or something. It's like produced by the protocol that's there. So on that sense, that's like a definition of content that I think is really interesting. Also content in the form of like, she was talking about how we go on like Shein or something and we buy like a neon green sweatshirt and it doesn't fit, and you wear it anyway, and someone sees you wearing this neon green hoodie that doesn't fit, and they feel this connection to you. It doesn't matter that the hoodie doesn't fit. It matters that that piece of content, if we can call the hoodie a piece of content, is like a connecting node that means that we traveled the internet in an overlapping way. Therefore, we share some kind of locality. And I think that is a super interesting way of thinking about content. Like think pieces are empty. They're also like music because they tend to, at this point, because they, I mean, I say that as someone who writes think pieces. So, you know, that's a self-effacing comment. But yeah, right. So I don't know if that doesn't really answer your question, but I think these terms are slippery. I think we're finding new ways of understanding what they mean. There is a difference between media and content, and I think it has to do with like programming language and surface effects, and on one side, and then the other side, how a user or a community is like actively utilizing that content, how they're finding it useful. Like if you're QAnon, you're looking for signs everywhere. That content is super useful in a certain way, but in a vacuum, that content is blank. Does that make sense? Did I put something out there?
No, completely. And I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Olivia because I was going to ask you about her, and maybe we'll follow up in a minute. But that it really seamlessly. It kind of segues into my next question, which is really part B of the first question, which is, and this came about in my preparatory talks with Tiffany Godoy from Vogue Japan for our conversation, and that had to do with, you know, what had seemed to be happening to fashion, you know, up till that sort of decisive moment at the end of 2022, very much led by, you know, the Balenciagafication of a fashion house, but not exclusively Balenciaga. But I think they they certainly became the sort of prow. I mean, I think Alessandro Michele era, Gucci at the beginning, obviously Virgil Abloh at Off-White. I mean, that whole sort of trinity of those house directors really shifted, it seems to me, the rules of the game, and it sort of made me think of a phrase, which is, that over the last few years, product has wanted to be content, and equally, content has wanted to be a product. Is that something you would agree with?
Absolutely. But
Yes, but
do you want to say more on that?
no.
I mean, 100% agree with that, though. Yes. I mean, and I feel like there's this like content exhaustion, right? I mean, we saw this, you brilliantly in your, real-time remediation of the Prada runway show are like, clothes are just clothes again. Isn't that a relief? And I think we're seeing a de-memification, a de-contentification of clothes, right? Because there's something that's really cringe about, I mean, I have this thought.
I mean, fashion for a while was acting as a bridge between the digital and your real, like your digital identity and your real life. It was like fashion made to be uploaded.
Right.
With you wearing it.
Right. I mean, it's also COVID and it's lockdown, so it's going to be remediated digitally first and foremost, probably.
But that's what I think of. Shein, to me, is digital fashion.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
No, and the idea that digital fashion is this sort of, I don't know, AR overlay, yada yada yada. Completely misses the point.
Totally.
Shein, because of the, ethically, immorally questionable kind of low price point, allows for people to buy these things, literally wear them once, a single fit for a single post, and then it goes straight to the landmine. No, I mean, this is fashion and clothing as literally as image content. No? I mean, it doesn't really serve any purpose beyond that.
I remember when phygital was a buzzword around fashion, but like, you're right. That's the real phygital clothing is Shein. Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think you made a really interesting and bold claim, which I'm glad you did, because that was the brief. You did your homework, which is that you believe that the next era of social media is composability, and I'm sort of curious. I'm sure we are all curious. If you could speculate to us what you think that will, what might that look and feel like?
We were actually just debating this like this morning, whether, we're constantly going through periods of unbundling and rebundling, right? In media and in content. And Julian was like, oh, well, there's going to be like a macro app, maybe not a killer app, but a macro app that's going to allow us to seamlessly switch between all these different platforms. And I was thinking maybe not, because what's really important.
Like a nested internet.
Nested internet. Right. And that could like an Urbit type situation.
Right.
Or something, right? And that could be true. But I mean, I think the really important thing that's happened over the past couple of years is that people are using constellations of different apps and media to get outside of the physics of it. Like the physics of it feel like you're stuck on these interstates and you want more variety. You don't want to be bound by the physics of these platforms. So like for the time being, I feel like it's going to be necessary to have lots of different independently organized apps with different economic models that are, some are competing, some are coexisting. And it's going to be, the burden's going to be on the user and the communities to be switching between all of these. I mean, this is a kind of hell in itself, right? I already miss so many messages because how many different messaging apps do we all use with different people? But I think that's the short term. In the long term, I imagine someone will innovate, and maybe this is an application of like crypto, right? Where there's some way of like making it more coherent, making it easier, more accessible. I mean, that's my like knee-jerk response to it.
Yeah, Julian, what do you think?
I mean, of course, right now Discord is kind of like where all the action is happening. I mean, I think the platforms have different uses, and it seems to me that there's sort of more awareness too of how a platform is best used. Like, I've seen rather serious people, obviously, like posting just obvious bait on Twitter, like the worst, like shit that gives me a headache, and like it's just intended to cause an argument. And then I realized, though, that they know exactly what they're doing. That's how Twitter works. That's what you use it for.
It's the game.
That's the game, right? And so I imagine still there's going to be some core app where at least the community gets together. But I also think that because communities do want to share their message or find new members, that the nice thing once you are organized in this community is that individual members can branch off into all kinds of different apps, and they sort of carry that culture with them. But I mean, it is one way we've been thinking about this, though, is that like communities or subcultures, like they emerge as like these meshes that are actually distributed between all of these different apps. And that's why like connections, like even a green hoodie is so important, because you start to realize when your mesh, which is very distributed, kind of overlays with somebody else's, where you share a lot of these points. Because I mean, people can be on the same platforms and never encounter each other, of course, by just the scale of it. So
I mean, we were having a discussion on our Discord about the Anna Imhoff show at Palais de Tokyo, and some people were like, well, there was this Mike Kelly, famous series of portraits where there's these stuffed animals, and he also appears. It was, also part of the Sonic Youth cover in the 90s. And they were like, oh, she's just using this Mike Kelly piece for like a style reason. I don't like how she's aestheticizing all these great artworks. There's these Sigmar polkas, there's a Katie Nolan, there's a Sturtevant piece, but she's just using them for style. And then, thinking about Anna's work and maybe seeing how people around her think too. I mean, she thinks very deeply about these pieces. She knows them very well. Maybe she's thinking differently about content, in that you don't have to have a 10-page press release related to every work. Maybe it's enough to use these pieces as like the green hoodie, like this organizing device. I've also passed through this canon. I've also had an emotional response to these things. And that's an interesting new way of thinking about content, and quite frankly, thinking about art. I mean, somewhere in here, there's a discussion about NFTs and, even jewelry or watches, or all these kinds of signifiers that we have, that I think the way that we use content for the time being is going through some kind of transformation.
To say one nice thing about blockchain Web3 as well, I think the new Ethereum wallet protocols will actually enable the sort of speculative community economies to actually function. As mobile wallets are now secured, you can set up some sort of economic system within your community to group fund projects, and really kind of the dream of the DAO seems a bit more attainable now. And it's one thing we've always had difficulty with in new models is crowdfunding and paying for these projects. I mean, we published a book and sold it and wanted to put the money back in the community, but we personally had to pay taxes on it, right? And so I think I do think that in terms of blockchain, it's really the simplest things are going to have the biggest effects, actually. Maybe all of the very complicated stuff was kind of a scam, and the simple functions, now that they're a lot more rigorous and secure, I think you might start to see internal economies emerge in these communities as well, which allows them to produce greater things and maybe even create new protocols, new apps themselves.
I mean, and that reminds me of a koan from Jack Self, which I think will remain eternally true, which is that form follows finance.
Oh yeah, right? Totally.
I've got a couple of questions, but before I sort of soldier on, I do want to see if there are any from the audience. Michal, I would love to bring you in here because I think what you're doing with Axis is sort of really interesting. But do we have a microphone at the front, please? So it was nice sitting next to you to see your kinetic physical reaction to some of the content here.
This was very good. What do you want me to do?
Do what you do best. Analogies.
Yeah. So I've spent 15 years collecting art, and then I spent the last 2 years collecting NFTs, and the transition has been very interesting. And I think a lot about modernity and post-modernity, in terms of there are objective truth and then there's everything is a vibe, and it's all about that. And I've been thinking a lot about NFTs in terms of how they relate to, like the green hoodie example, is that if you think about a Vermeer or a Vasquez, there was some objective truth that this is really fucking hard to do and I can't do it, so I'm going to appreciate it for the sheer skill. And then you go into the Bowery, the new museum in New York, and it's like there's two hoses and a chair, and this is basically a critique of the middle class. And you need to have read 89 books and gone to 300 exhibitions to understand that. And then when I was collecting NFTs, it was really interesting to be like, well, what's a good NFT? And why is a Bored Ape at 100 ETH? And why is like a happy lion at like 0.5 ETH? Like, why didn't that take out? And it's vibes. And then the question is like, where do vibes come from? Right? Like, how do we collectively agree that this thing has a vibe and this thing does not have a vibe or has a weird vibe? And I thought a lot about how NFTs basically are like sort of at the forefront of art in terms of that they are the maximally inclusive and maximal agency to the audience. Like literally you can meme an NFT into existence. Do you know the MFers or motherfuckers NFTs? Those guys were meme. They were free to mint, and then they did a whole bunch of things by Satoshi. But then if you think of sort of what photography did to painting, is that it like basically it released or freed artists from basically representing reality and being able to do something. And I feel like what NFTs have done is that they've basically allowed more people to be involved in defining, is this art? And so in that way, it's been maximally really interesting. And I've been thinking a lot about what that means to all that downstream media that we have. So I was really interested in that graph of Web 1, Web 2 versus Web 3, and it made a lot of sense to me that Web 3 is really Web 1 plus Web 2 to an extent. So I don't really have a great concluding comment.
That's exactly
respond to that.
why you're in the front row, Michelle.
Thanks.
But Carly, if you've got something.
I mean, I think what's really interesting here, and this is, for a whole nother conference, but like what NFT culture thinks is art or thinks what is good art. I think there's like, I would say that the original sin in that scenario that you mapped out, which is great, is that like, why does a new museum have to, like, why does that chair example have to scale? Like, why does that have to be intelligible to a lot of people? If that made a ton of sense to the community that it was first presented to, and that's great, that's fine. I mean, I have the feeling that, art is made continuously by anyone who, to quote Artaud, needs to get out of hell, right? Anytime you need to tell a truth, you break the rules and you make something that expresses that reality. And sometimes that's going to be relevant for 5 people. And sometimes that's going to be like a Duchamp or a Warhol situation, right? And scalability isn't like the fact that it's like maximally inclusive isn't the definition of art. That's a really cool quality of art when it does it effectively, but it doesn't have to be like the base quality. And I think there's this weird slippage that happens where like, a lot of time with NFTs, they're like, well, the most people can decide what the best thing is. That's fine, but that also puts us, that's not up anymore. That also just puts us in a mid situation, right? Where you have really smart people or valuable opinions or whatever. Then you have people who are trying to game the system as part of that, right? So do we really end up with a greater truth? I'm not sure. But it's a huge conversation, a really interesting one. It's one that NFTs absolutely have made visible to us. So yeah, anyway, that's my response.
I mean, I also think NFTs, they do, all kinds of like really interesting and cool emergent phenomena in art and games have been puzzles and all kinds of things have come out of them. I guess I'm always I always wonder why necessarily do they need to be integrated into the art world as we traditionally think of it, because they seem to me something incredibly novel and really interesting, but like really solely taking place within the world of the digital and the logic of the digital. But about vibes, I think you're right that it's incredibly important and incredibly powerful. I mean, we had a milady up there. It's like a very weird, kind of edgy, sometimes toxic community, but they've done a really, really good job of organizing a community together around vibes and sort of keeping the true name intact. And that's kind of what I meant by it. Like, what's the Milady scene? Like, it actually, no one's been able to name it. It's sort of evaded that
Categorization.
Yeah, that categorization, and thereby sort of a ability to be
instrumentalized.
Yeah. But I mean, when we were talking to Olivia too, she was talking about how she sees all of these kind of like think pieces or didactic kind of like Twitter style hot takes as just fan fiction. Like, if it isn't a hard fact or a hard data or truth, like, it might as well be fan fiction. And I mean, fan fictions though are incredibly powerful, and there we see a lot of opportunity in it, and then we see also very scary aspects of it in the way that the very far right has sort of created a vibe now and is using, terrorgram to organize attacks on energy infrastructure in the United States and other parts of the world. That's very scary, seeing how vibes can organize terrorism in new ways. And I think on the inverse, though, vibes will also organize communities that end up bringing a lot of positive innovation and really the next era of media.
Thank you so much. Anybody else that have a question or kind of intervention? We've just got a few minutes left. I mean, I love that Olivia's name keeps coming up. And I maybe just want to spend a couple of minutes on this because it's the latest episode of New Models. It dropped last week, I think.
Also,
and
our youngest guest.
Your youngest guest. How old is she now? 22?
Yeah, somewhere between
something.
22 and 25. Yeah.
24, 25. And I mean, it's interesting because I mean, you do tell us that the final edit has been edited considerably. But if we read between the lines, there was, if I understood, I mean, my feeling was we were seeing kind of generational tectonic plates playing against each other, a little bit like that animation that you showed about the sort of, the ice caps crashing against each other. And at the same time, I just read a piece about Generation Zalpha. Zalpha, which
Love
is the combination of Generation Z and the next generation, which apparently is going to be Alpha, because where else are we going to go? And, Generation Zalpha, the youngest cohort of Generation Zalpha apparently is 10 years old. So they're the children of elderly millennials. And somebody said they're the first generation that were handed the phone at the same time they were handed the pacifier. And, and so there's this, again, there's a sort of another timeline, which is, I mean, I have a very, boomer-like question, which I love to ask people, which is what was your first memory of the internet?
He always has that question. We love that
right?
question.
And of course, people my generation, your generation, certain generation, it'll be like, well, somewhere in the 90s, and or I was 12 years old, and now it's at some point it's just a stupid question to ask, right? Because it's like asking me or my generation about a world before television or a world before radio. It just doesn't matter anymore. But yeah, I was really curious about the kind of meta commentary introduction that you did for this conversation with Olivier, and could you say something about, I mean, what don't we hear in the final edit about what happened in this conversation?
I mean, it was a lot of us repeatedly trying to discover the true name of the sort of scenes and styles and fashion she was talking about, and sort of realize it took a while for us to realize that we were talking on two different scopes, really, and that's where we really realized that being one scale up, like thinking meta about all of these things and the way the media and the language and the content itself operates is a paradigm shift.
I mean, I'll also say though that like when you edit something, the great thing is like you can hear things much more objectively. And some of it we were chalking up to being Gen Z or living in a certain media environment, but also some of it is just like being 20 something, right? And like not wanting your scene to be named. And that's true. That's always been true of being in your 20s. But yeah, it was like, we kept asking Olivia the same question again in different ways. And she kept on just, at certain points, she was just like, I think the fact that I have absolutely no feelings in response to this question is indicative of the fact that we're approaching this from completely different paradigms. And all content for her was just kind of like cringe. It was a surface effect. It wasn't the point. The point was programming.
Or something to be instrumentalized, like something you make kind of with a purpose in mind.
It's something that millennials would use. But of course, I mean, the point that we also make in that intro was that like millennials saw this media crash in the 10s and it was really like semiotic soup. Like it was dangerous too. If you use something the wrong way, you know, like you're going to maybe have to defend yourself and you're saying something you don't intend to say or whatever. And I think that millennials were using medium.com and I guess early Substack or their own blogs or whatever to create a kind of scaffolding to get themselves out of that semiotic soup. So medium.com was like, that's where you build the scaffolding. I'm going to hot take and think pieces. That's like where the Venkatesh Raos, the Ribbon Farms, the Kneeling Busk, like these kinds of people, I mean, that was necessary to just get us out of this, to use Venkat's term, log level, where we just could never see. It's like the difference between being a pedestrian in Dubai and like maybe at least taking the metro or being in a higher space. You just didn't have any perspective. So that was necessary. But now for Gen Z, they see it as opportunistic. Like they see it as, oh, you want to be an influencer, or oh, you're using this content to build your own profile. Kind of like the example of the different media types where you have Essence and O32C and very smartly building their own media companies to build their profile, to world build. So Gen Z sees millennials using content to world build in order to build their own personal brands. They see it almost as disingenuous, which, I mean, they also are really aware of all different kinds of scams. They have like a scammer gaze.
That's
so
the thing is
they're
everything.
Like looking for the scam
to their view, they're raised in a soup of scamming. And it's just so everything is there's like a deep skepticism towards the sort of motivation or desire behind every piece of media or content.
So we try to make ourselves not look like scammers, and that's what we edited out, or just not to look like
just not look like boomers.
Yeah, boomers. It was so embarrassing.
I think there are not three certainties in life. There are not two certainties in life. There are three. We commonly believe there are only death and taxes, but there are death, taxes, and then we all become boomers.
That's true.
At some point. We're exactly where we need to be to wrap this up. But my last question is, and it echoes, I think, what Chris just asked Audrey and Clara, and I guess it's also one of my kind of common questions at the moment, or refrains. So I have this new lexicon of lawcore coming out pretty soon on Zora Zine. One of the terms is agnostimistic, which is neither pessimistic nor optimistic, but a secret third thing, which is, I think, my perspective. But I'm curious, are you optimistic, are you pessimistic, are you agnostimistic when it comes to where we're going in terms of, the future platform physics? Julian?
I'm feeling pretty just mystical right now.
Mystical. Just mystic.
Yeah.
Mystical.
Divining.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, I always keep coming back to just the feeling of awe, which is like both scary and thrilling and wondrous at the same time. That's kind of how I feel and what I try to always look for, channel, because it kind of stays aware of all of the complexity of it, and without, I guess, emotionally coloring it in either an optimistic or pessimistic way.
It's another secret third thing.
Yeah.
Carly?
Yeah, I guess I'm with you on that. And I think that if you're not feeling that, then you're like, you kind of need to push harder. Like it's up
You're
to
on
you.
a one-way train to Boomersville.
Maybe so, exactly. You are otherwise. I mean, I think you need to be always finding that. I would say that's true also in any art practice as well. You need to be feeling that thrill and also that like awe or something. Otherwise, like maybe you're resting on your laurels, or which is also fine. Everyone can move upstate at some point. That's a nice part of life. But yeah.
We are out of time, but what an amazing hour it's been. Will you please join me in a really heartfelt thanks to Carly and Julian from New Models. Thank you so much.